Good afternoon. My name is Robert Pine. I'm Program Director for the Mothi Center. I'd like to welcome you to this program, the first in a series of webinars to discuss refugee resettlement in America and here in Brown County, Wisconsin in particular. This program is co-sponsored by Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Green Bay, Wisconsin Literacy, and the Mothi Center. The Mothi Center is an independent nonprofit on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, dedicated to the promotion of peace, justice, and mutual respect, supporting individual and community flourishing while welcoming all cultures and faiths. The center's educational programs create space for curiosity, reflection, and respectful conversation, addressing vital concerns as we seek to move forward together. Wisconsin Literacy is a nonprofit statewide coalition of literacy agencies. They strengthen literacy statewide through expert training, personalized consultations, health literacy, workforce connections, and advocacy. The Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Green Bay is an affiliate agency of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, one of the few national organizations authorized by the U.S. State Department to resettle refugees. Catholic Charities is the only agency managing initial resettlement and placement for newly arrived refugees during their first 3 months in Brown County. And they collaborate with many other offices and nonprofits to provide extended support beyond that crucial 3-month period. Before introducing our guest for this afternoon, I'd like to note that we will have time at the end to address some of your questions, which can be submitted at any time using the Q&A or chat features at the bottom of your screen. Today's guest is Dr. Alise Coen, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Her research explores intersections of human rights, migration, refugees, and U.S. foreign policy at local and global levels. She's the author of Reconfiguring Refugees, the U.S. Retreat from Responsibility Sharing, published this summer by New York University Press. It's not quite out. I think it's another month or so, and we'll be able to get our hands on it. This is an incredibly important topic, as today there are a record number of people, 120 million, forcibly displaced around the world. I don't expect we're going to be able to say much about the causes for that today, especially since most have been forced to leave their homes due to armed conflict. But we do need to think about how we and the rest of the world address the current crisis. Of the 120 million forcibly displaced, about 70 million are still trying to find safety within their own countries. The rest have become refugees, forced to flee beyond their borders. If closer to 50 million refugees sounds more manageable, think of it as almost the entire west coast of the US. The combined populations of California, Oregon, and Washington forced to flee for their lives. While most are simply looking for a place of refuge if they cannot return home, many hope to resettle in the US. And that's where US refugee policy comes in. Professor Alise Coen will be speaking today on the topic, US refugee policy and resettlement. Alise, I know this is not just an important topic, but it's a really complex one. You're the best person I know to help us understand it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Bob. And I want to really thank Bob in particular for the work organizing this and the Mothi Center, also Catholic Charities and Wisconsin Literacy as the co-sponsors. And just thank you to all the attendees who are present today on this really important topic during the week of recognizing World Refugee Day. I'm going to share my screen for my PowerPoint slides so that people can see those. And I'm going into presentation mode there. So hopefully you have a nice view here. And this is essentially the introduction as Bob mentioned, I'm Associate Professor of Political Science. I'm also the chair of the Public and Environmental Affairs Unit at UW Green Bay. And on this opening slide, I have a couple of the photo ops that have been popular over the decades where US presidents pose with hugging or holding refugee children. And this is something that is sort of a theme in US refugee policy, is that the executive branch, the presidency, tends to use refugee resettlement, overseas refugee resettlement, as something to really bolster the US image, the idea of the US as a savior or a beacon of hope or a rescuer country for the rest of the world. And so I find this parallel really interesting, where you see Nixon with the Hungarian refugee children decades ago, and then Biden doing a similar photo op with Ukrainian refugee children in 2022. And so to get started, I also like to make sure that we're all on the same page just regarding what we mean by refugees, because this is a term that gets used in a wide range of contexts. And sometimes there is confusion over which groups exactly we're talking about or which groups are included. So for US policy, we do have these divides in the categories of humanitarian migration. So it's also operating really as a legal device for exclusion. Refugees are technically those who are referred for that status only from outside of the United States. So we're talking about embassies, the United Nations Refugee Agency, also known as the UNHCR. Whereas asylum seekers, or those seeking asylum, are those who are already on US territory or they're arriving at a US port of entry. And so here we're thinking more about those spontaneous arrivals, perhaps at the southern border, that get a lot of media attention. And they're perhaps claiming asylum for similar reasons of persecution from harm or torture, but they're different than technically the legal category of refugees, because refugees means those who are being resettled from overseas. And so that overseas admissions process is kind of what distinguishes what we mean when we talk about refugees in a more technical sense. And we have this little image in the lower right of your screen from World Relief that's showing us that overseas admissions screening process for refugees. It's very lengthy. It can take an average of 2.5 to 3 years to go through all of those steps with the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security. And so this is something where the government feels like there is a great deal of control and pre-selection of who is going through the vetting process and who is accepted and admitted as a refugee. Whereas asylum, again, when we're talking about asylum seekers, those that are already at or arriving at US ports of entry, there's a sense from the government perspective that there's less control, that it's harder to manage, that it's less orderly. And those are some of the reasons that we see really different media depictions at times of those who are resettled overseas as refugees versus those who are seeking asylum on US territory. So I hope that that helps if there were just some people in the audience that were thinking about, what is that distinction? The US does not always actually follow the legal category of the refugee definition and who policymakers call refugees. So we need to keep in mind at the same time that there is that legal distinction, that there's a lot of discretion policymakers can use, especially the executive branch, but also Congress, in designating people for humanitarian protection, and then even just sort of popularly referring to the groups that are admitted and resettled as refugees, even if technically they're admitted on some other basis. And so despite that really rigid definition of the refugee admissions procedures, in practice, we have had a lot of cases where policymakers were not following that perfect overseas admissions process outlined on the previous slide, but were making exceptions based on political context. And this is often related to not only the varying political context, but varying perceptions of who those groups are and whether they're deserving or not of protection. So during the Balkans crisis in the late 1990s, roughly 20,000 refugees from Kosovo, pictured here, that's President Clinton, another shot of a US president embracing a refugee child And so there, Clinton is embracing a Kosovar refugee child. And during that Balkans crisis, roughly 20,000 were evacuated from Macedonia and flown to US military bases as what's called parolees. So another vocabulary term for you, parolees. And then they were processed directly at the US military bases to earn the refugee status for lawful residence and access to assistance once they arrive in the US. So again, it didn't perfectly follow that, overseas referral through the UNHCR or US Embassy and going through all those steps, but instead it was done through those US military bases and as parolees. And looking at the images on the left, we are reminded of other exceptions. So the Vietnamese that were resettled after the fall of Saigon were and are commonly referred to as refugees, but many of the 130,000 or so were actually evacuated and airlifted directly from South Vietnam in Marine and Air Force helicopters. They were transported to US military bases in the Pacific. Then they were transported for processing, and most were admitted as parolees rather than refugees officially. So what Congress did in those cases, as with the Cubans, for those early waves of Cubans that were airlifted out of Cuba on the so-called freedom flights, they actually used humanitarian parole to do it, and then they did status adjustment acts. So Congress passed legislation which basically gave those groups like the Vietnamese, the Cubans, et cetera, refugee designation and protection and a pathway for legal permanent status and access to benefits. What they have in common is, in terms of the US policymakers making those exceptions to the traditional overseas admissions process, is they were viewed as anti-communist allies, and as, in some cases, even the Cuban elite groups that were part of the early waves as more racially white, and as linked with their anti-communism. And so we can see there is that discretion that I want people to keep in mind when they think about policy, refugee policy, that there is a power to use humanitarian parole, and then essentially they become de facto refugees. They get those benefits, they get the access to the same status once Congress passes the Adjustment Acts. If you're curious to learn more about the Vietnam case, I wanted to give some book recommendations today, just so you can also, think beyond this presentation that you're hearing from me to look into other scholars and authors. Yenli Espiritu has a really fascinating book on the US evacuation of Vietnamese anti-communist allies and the resettlement of all those Vietnamese as refugees. Again, technically parolees at first, and it's called Body Counts. And she has this concept of militarized refuge, which I also think is really fascinating, that the US often uses its military infrastructure to justify its foreign policy interventions, and at the same time to kind of process and resettle refugees, and how the foreign policy and the military operations and the refugee resettlement operations all end up kind of intertwined, bound together. So if that's just a topic that interests you, that would be a book that you could look into. It was published in 2014, so there's lots of variations of it available. Something else that relates to a broad theme in US refugee policy that comes into my own research quite a bit is this mythology of American exceptionalism. Again, the idea that to justify refugee resettlement, policymakers tend to emphasize that the US is a beacon of hope, a refuge, a savior, a rescuer. And this is a bipartisan theme historically across Republican and Democratic administrations. So this idea of the open-armed America when it comes to refugees. This is a quote from Ronald Reagan's acceptance speech at the Republican National Committee in 1980, when he's sort of justifying refugee resettlement, which the ceilings were very high in the early 80s. Can we doubt that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom? Here is a refuge for all people in the world who yearn to breathe freely. We see this language repeated across administrations over time. I won't excerpt all the quotes, but you can find George W. Bush making similar quotes. You can find George H.W. Bush offering these kinds of quotes, Bill Clinton. Carter, so there really is this idea that there's something special about the United States, that it is a safe haven or a shining city on the hill, that we see a lot used to justify bipartisan support for refugee resettlement. At the same time, for refugees, and particularly for asylum seekers, they see the history as a bit more complicated than that. They understand that there are these contradictions often in what policymakers may be saying about a safe haven and a beacon of hope or a city on the hill, versus also the US having this very exclusionary history, right? Where on one hand, there's language of the United States being a nation of immigrants. At the same time, it has coexisted in a very complex, contradictory way with this nativism, this idea that those who are immigrants or even internal minorities are foreign and therefore may pose a threat to what's called the American way of life. And nativism is really about this idea of perceiving a cultural threat posed by immigration, including refugees. So we want to keep that in the back of our mind whenever we're studying or thinking about refugee policy, is this long, deep history of the contradiction or kind of a paradox of the nation of immigrants, beacon of hope rhetoric on one hand, and some policies that go along with it, and on the other hand, very exclusionary, racially based, nationality based quotas, national origin quotas in our laws historically, and both of those things coexisting in this really complex way. One other thing to keep in mind within that history is the bipartisan support has been there for quite a while. And we saw with the Refugee Act, which was passed in 1980, that did have bipartisan support. The Refugee Act harmonized US domestic law with international legal standards around refugees. So, giving the definition of who's a refugee, religious, nationality-based, racial or political opinion, or membership in a social group, it's somehow being persecuted on the basis of one of those criteria. The Refugee Act in 1980 established a ceiling to resettle around 50,000 refugees, whereas the previous admission ceiling had been a little over 17,000. But in practice, those ceilings had not meant much because they had been repeatedly exceeded through presidents using that humanitarian parole authority we were looking at earlier with the Vietnamese, et cetera. And so the Refugee Act adopted a lot of the refugee convention language from international law, like non-refoulement, the obligation not to return someone to a territory where they face harm or torture or persecution. But at the same time, the ceilings have not really been codified in any meaningful way. So there can be this major variation in, how many refugees annually is the target for admission. Here you're seeing data from the Migration Policy Institute, which I think is just a really helpful context piece, because the blue is showing us the annual ceiling, technically, officially, that the president and Congress agree to each fiscal year. And then the orange is showing us the actual number of overseas refugees that are admitted. And so these are those coming through that overseas refugee admission process or some version of that. And it was very high, starting out. It gets lower during the Reagan administration for a period. It climbs back up with a lot of resettlement, not only from Vietnam and other parts of South Asia, but also moving into the former Soviet states in the early 1990s. And so, we were as high at one point over 200,000 per year. And then we were, during the George H.W. Bush administration, resettling in the 120 to 140K range per year. Then you see there is this gradual move during the Clinton administration, lowering the actual number and the ceilings down a bit, right? So what we end up with is kind of like an average of about 80,000 per year that are resettled. And we can sort of see that average with the blue line for the ceilings. After 9/11, the actual number will dip way down because of some of the changes around the reorganization of the Department of Homeland Security. But it was a bipartisan effort to correct that and get more refugees readmitted from overseas. That included both Democrats and Republicans. So during the early 2000s, it climbs a little bit back up. Prior to the Trump administration, again, we're at that roughly close to the 80,000, 70 to 80,000 range per year. And then, of course, there's this major turning point with the 2015-2016 election cycle. That is sort of the story of what happened with that, is something I detail in my book, Reconfiguring Refugees. So I'm happy to speak more about that or answer questions about, what happens when we see that massive drop off and it's a new record low, the lowest level of refugees ever resettled by the US. Biden does set the ceiling higher to start rebuilding and repairing that resettlement infrastructure, but it doesn't perform well. It has a lot of obstacles in that the first couple of years of Biden's term. And then, of course, a lot are not counted here that are parolees from Afghanistan and Ukraine because they don't have refugee status. They're only given temporary protection. But a lot of the resettlement organizations are also devoting funds and resources to helping with Afghan, Ukrainian resettlement as temporary humanitarian parolees. So that's part of that story, that, as Biden is not able to or failing to meet the ceilings of official overseas refugee resettlement. And then it has been climbing up a little bit in the last fiscal year. So I hope that it just gives you an overview if you're somebody interested in like the context around the wide variation in ceilings, that we don't really have a norm established or codified regarding what the ceiling should be. And we also just have all these questions over, what is a fair share that the United States should be resettling? When you hear some of those global numbers that Bob mentioned at the start, in terms of just the overwhelming amount of displacement worldwide, what is the US capacity versus what the US is actually doing in practice? For a little bit of context on that question, we can also think about, the global aspect of which countries are hosting the most refugees. And historically, the countries that are doing the most to host displaced people are actually the lower and middle income countries. So they have, less resources, far less resources than a country like the United States in terms of wealth and capacity measures, right? This is a really interesting figure that I was reading in a recent report. 1% of the world's GDP, countries that account for 1% of the world's GDP, host around 40% of the world's refugees. So that's reiterating the extent that, it's mostly these lower income countries that are doing the greatest responsibility sharing for taking in displaced people and hosting them on their territory. Not a resettlement, third country overseas, resettlement, but hosting them, which, if you look at that as a measure of responsibility sharing, US policymakers don't often give these other countries that credit, right? Like Turkey, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, Uganda, Sudan, Colombia. Like these are really the heavy hitters that are doing so much hosting. We also see, Germany has done both hosting and official resettlement. So Germany is one that stands out. And if you would actually start thinking about per capita, you would see countries like Germany, Canada, Sweden, you could argue that they have been more leaders in refugee resettlement than the US. When you take into account, they have much less capacity. They have smaller populations, and in some cases, they may have, less wealth to distribute. But in any case, that's like the global context that I think can help with this question of responsibility sharing. Also thinking about refugee diversity in Wisconsin kind of helps us connect the global portrait to the local portrait. And, the Wisconsin DCF, the Department of Children and Families, since 2000 says that around 16,000 people categorized as refugees fleeing persecution overseas have been resettled in the state of Wisconsin. And they represent over 50 countries worldwide. And this is something I find really interesting in my research too, is when we are exploring refugee policy, we end up opening a door for exploring how local sites, education, culture, industry, are really shaped by global dynamics and global movements of people. And we also pick up this theme of US foreign policy really heavily being intertwined with overseas refugee resettlement policy. And we can connect to that in the state of Wisconsin because, of course, one of the largest refugee groups we have resettled in the state historically are the Hmong refugees from the 1970s, from Southeast Asia. A lot of individuals who were put at risk due to their support for the covert US military operations. So that was part of the CIA's secret war in Laos, if you want to look more into the CIA's secret war for more on that history. We also see a lot of these groups were helping with the fight against the North Vietnamese, against the communist government. So they were similarly depicted as anti-communist allies as part of the justification. And when the US forces withdrew, it's important to note that a lot of those that were there were sort of abandoned for a while before these waves of resettlement. They were just kind of awaiting resettlement and facing persecution, a lot of them put into camps in Thailand. So California, Minnesota, and Wisconsin have some of the largest populations of the Hmong refugees, highlighting that connection with US foreign policy, anti-communism, and US refugee resettlement policy. We also see some of the top origin countries around the world are reflected in the refugees that are resettled in the state. Keeping in mind, the top countries of origin right now for refugees are Syria and Afghanistan and Ukraine, and then as well Venezuela. And those, account for over half of all refugees worldwide. But then different US states essentially end up hosting different specific refugee populations based on the history and so forth. So aside from Hmong refugees, we see that the intersection of US refugee policy with Wisconsin sort of state policy is a lot have been resettled from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Myanmar, which was formerly known as Burma. Also from Somalia, from Bosnia, from Iraq, to a lesser extent and more recently from Afghanistan. So one thing to keep in mind is that we do see a lot of complexity in the drivers of these refugee situations. What is going on in those origin countries? So like those fleeing Somalia, many of whom have been resettled in the state of Wisconsin, they're facing a combination of things: political instability, violence of a civil war, a really protracted civil war going on since the 1990s. We also see that layered with drought issues that have displaced people and made suffering even more intense. So drought across the Horn of Africa that has worsened, potable water shortages, crops destroyed, livelihoods destroyed, and just really an acute shortage of arable land for Somalis that has interacted in this dynamic way with actual violence and civil war. If we would look a little closer at Iraq in terms of understanding the overlapping multi-layered causes of displacement there, we see those in Iraq are escaping really intense sectarian civil war conditions, tracing back with the US invasion from 2003, over 300,000 Iraqis killed as part of the war in Iraq, along with, of course, 8,000 or so US military personnel. We see a lot of Iraqis working for US personnel as translators or for NGOs, have attempted to come through what's called the SIV, the Special Immigrant Visa process, but there's a tremendous backlog in the SIV process. So it can take years, or even, one missing form, piece of paperwork, and the SIV process can delay or unravel everything for those translators. And so that's one of the complexities too, is that we have not only, different causes of displacement, we also have these different categories of admission. Thinking about how multi-layered some of these conditions are, in Iraq, it's not only that sort of post-conflict sectarian civil war, but we also have the ISIS insurgency that's been very active there, and we have climate-induced displacement. These are some graphics that kind of show us from data from the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, tracking how many people have been displaced by things like record high temperatures in central and southern Iraq, water scarcity, an increase in the salinity of rivers that are straining the agricultural sector there, and really just disrupting the ability to have any kind of sustainable livelihood. And so once again, it's not just a very clear-cut causal reason for the displacement of, why do Iraqis become internally displaced or become refugees or apply for SIV. It's also a mixture. It's intensified by these environmental climate change factors. And that brings to issue one of the key challenges with US refugee policy that has not been resolved. And that is that we have this trouble parsing out voluntary versus forced migrants, because we would like to think that it's always black and white, that someone can be categorized as, entirely choosing voluntarily to migrate and cross borders, versus entirely 100% being forced by some category of political persecution or human rights abuse. Often it is kind of a combination of those factors. And Dina Nayeri, who is a refugee originally from Iran, writes about this in one of her books. She talks about, every day in their new life, a refugee is asked to prove and differentiate themselves from, the opportunist who's just an economic migrant. But in reality, it's often a lot harder to have just, one category or the other, because there are these overlapping multi-layered forces of environment, lack of sustainable livelihood, intermixing with conditions of conflict, war, political persecution, and human rights violations. Again, a book recommendation, in case you're interested in that author I just mentioned, Dina Nayeri. She has this very powerful book, The Ungrateful Refugee. And that's really interesting for those of us who are interested in refugee policy and refugee experiences, because she writes a lot about the concept of needing to be grateful, and always trying to reiterate to Americans that, oh yes, we're so grateful to be resettled from Iran, especially as she was a child growing up in the US with her family. That constant pressure was there to prove that she was like the good kind of migrant, the really deserving, grateful kind of refugee. And this sort of you want to say like glosses over the US foreign policy actions that often contribute or are culpable in why these groups are displaced in the first place. And so, that's just something to keep in mind, is this expectation that refugees should be grateful. And how does that interact with the extent to which the US might actually bear some responsibility in the different conditions that have displaced them? We also see another major group resettled in Wisconsin are the Congolese refugees, and that gives us another really good example of how complex these conflict situations are and why they are not easy or fast to resolve, and why refugees are often waiting in camps, for years. Another reminder that just brings to light how long that wait and period in limbo is, it's less than 1%, often less than 1% of those awaiting resettlement registered with the UNHCR as refugees eligible for resettlement actually are resettled, right? So it's just a tiny, narrow pathway when we think about refugee resettlement through the overseas admission process. So for most people, they will not win that kind of lottery. They will not be able to be permanently resettled. But in the Congo, going back to that example of a really complex conflict situation, we have the Congolese army, we have non-state armed militia groups, we have rebel fighters now associated with ISIL or ISIS, known as the Allied Democratic Forces. And we also have the intervention of neighboring states like Rwanda that have been charged with, in some cases, aiding some of the rebel groups in that area. So major areas of fighting then in the Congo have been cut off from humanitarian aid. There are severe food shortages. Over 23 million people were food insecure in the Congo as of 2023, roughly 2 million children at risk of starvation. Again, thinking back to that concept of what is a fair share of refugee responsibility sharing, we can keep in mind that most Congolese refugees are hosted by Uganda and other neighboring countries in that part of Africa. So those neighboring countries are currently doing the most of the burden sharing or refugee hosting. World Relief, of course, is one of the faith-based organizations in Wisconsin really active in resettlement of Congolese refugees, many of whom are of Catholic or Christian religious identity. And this is an image of the resettlement of a family in Appleton arriving from resettlement support through World Relief. Also, another book recommendation, if you want to hear more from a refugee's perspective, and also just a really great writer, there's this Congolese refugee author and poet, J.J. Bola. And, J.J. Bola fled the Congo with his family at the age of 6 and is now based in London, but he's also served as a US refugee ambassador and worked in mental health areas. He has a really powerful poem called Refuge, which you can find on YouTube with him reading it if you're interested to hear that. He also has a lot of books of poetry, like Word is one of them that was published in 2015. And his latest novel, because he writes a lot of fiction, is The Selfless Act of Breathing from 2022. So just some more recommendations if you're interested to go beyond this presentation. And he brings in a lot of the refugee experiences into his writing and poetry. As we sort of near towards the end of what I've prepared for today, another thing, kind of big picture to keep in mind about US refugee policy is there are these very different experiences of welcoming based on who the group is and how they're perceived. So, Ukrainian that's resettled as a humanitarian parolee, commonly labeled as a Ukrainian refugee, will likely have far more connections to the large Ukrainian American diaspora and a network of private sponsors through things like U4U, the United for Ukraine private sponsorship program that the Biden administration created for those parolees. Then, for example, someone displaced from Venezuela who might not be so readily viewed as a deserving refugee and maybe more questioned because they're coming from South America. Well, are they an economic migrant? What are their categories of persecution? Those things get more scrutinized than for Ukrainians. And we also will find that they don't have the kind of vocal and active diaspora in US politics to help give them the support that Ukrainians have. Ukrainian refugees, or again, technically parolees, have received support from both Republicans and Democrats. And there are a lot of local officials and people who become leaders who are Ukrainian Americans. We don't really see that level for people that are from Venezuela or asylum seekers from Haiti, for example, which have been especially facing challenges. I mean, I think that's the largest category in the latest data I had seen of those who are denied their asylum requests is people from Haiti that are seeking asylum. Again, often arriving at a port of entry rather than being resettled through an embassy or something like that. But we have this really discriminatory treatment. It's borne out in lots of ways. The Ukrainian case is one way that we've seen that. But it's just something to keep in mind when we're thinking about the experiences that refugees have and what ends up shaping refugee policy. We also have this issue of political polarization. So in addition to finding more favorable attitudes towards Ukrainians across both Republicans and Democrats that you're seeing here from this Gallup survey, where 61% of Republicans were supportive of admitting Ukrainian refugees, 92% of Democrats. It's a huge drop-off when we go to other groups that are considered less deserving, often intersecting with being viewed as less racially white. So those from Honduras and Central America, for example, there's this major partisan gap in Democratic support versus Republican support for admitting those from Central America. Also Syria, we saw that major gap, although even for Democrats, it was a bit lower level of support. And if we go back to Kosovo, it was kind of not a polarized issue. It was across the board sort of support for Kosovar refugees. And then all the way back decades, Gallup had looked at support for Vietnamese refugee resettlement, and it was really low, but it was sort of across the board low. So you could say that there was a kind of bipartisan consensus of distaste for refugee resettlement in general. And that has changed. And that is a new policy challenge for refugee policies, just grappling with the amount to which overseas admissions have become a very politically divisive issue now. We also see this interesting survey done on Afghan evacuees, Afghan refugees, following the US and international troop withdrawal in 2021. We see that polarization is in play, roughly, divided 56% was kind of the net support for admitting thousands of refugees from Afghanistan. So it's, just a little over half of respondents. But where we really start to get more information is when we look at Democrat support. Well, that's really high. It was like 75% of those who identified as Democrats were supportive of admitting Afghan refugees, compared with 35% of those identifying as Republicans. And even within the Republican Party, we've seen intra-party divisions over Afghan allies who assisted US military personnel. The Afghan Adjustment Act is something that has been proposed year after year since the withdrawal to help those Afghan evacuees gain access to permanent status and the protection that comes with that. And just a few lawmakers from the Republican Party, even though there are other Republicans who disagree with them, have been able to hold up that Afghan Adjustment Act and prevent it from moving forward in Congress. So that's part of the reason we haven't seen movement to really, codify some kind of adjustment for Afghan evacuees. Is in part, we have to go back to partisan polarization over this issue. Something else to keep in mind as we're wrapping up this portion is stereotyping and discrimination. Why is it that we see a party division between things like Syrian refugees and Ukrainian refugees, or intra-party divisions over Afghan evacuees? And, that's something I trace a lot of the rise of that in my book during the 2015-16 election cycle, and what happened, how it became sort of mainstream to link those groups, any really Muslim groups of refugees, with ISIS or terrorism or Al-Qaeda, or thinking about Afghans, now the Taliban is brought up. And the suspicions of terrorism and sort of how that plays with the refugee experiences. Because in many cases, those Afghan parolees have been fleeing Taliban persecution at the same time then that policymakers will accuse them or suspect them of, being covert members of the Taliban trying to come through the refugee or evacuation process. And this is just another graphic to sort of help with the context, because there has been this claim that some policymakers will use that, most refugees resettled now are Muslim men, but that's just not factually correct. We see that over the course of 2010 to 2020, there's been a majority of the refugees identifying with some kind of Christian religious affiliation, and just about a third identifying as Muslim. And then about 64% have been women and children, whereas just 36% men and boys over 14. Again, I want to be careful with that, though, because I feel like it can sometimes play into the women and children focus that might then devalue the life of men or render male refugees equivalent to potential terrorists. And so we also want to just be careful with that whenever we're talking about justifying things based on being women and children. And most of the origin countries between 2010 and 2020, by the way, have been varied, like Myanmar, Bhutan in Southern Asia, the DRC in Central Africa. So there are these gaps between the realities of refugee resettlement diversity and then more stereotypical depictions that policymakers might use. I think, in conclusion, one of the biggest challenges US refugee policy will need to face is this broader context of fortified borders, countries across the world really making it harder for there to be legal corridors for humanitarian protection. So as the choice to migrate legally becomes harder and harder, and there are just less pathways for legal humanitarian migration, less refugee resettlement slots, less other forms of humanitarian entry or protection, what is going to happen with US refugee policy is that people are going to increasingly attempt to cross irregularly that would otherwise possibly or even likely qualify for refugee status. But it's just no longer viewed as even practical to have to wait that long, or again, if you're thinking only 1 to 1.5% of all those eligible to be resettled actually end up getting resettled, is it really practical to pursue resettlement? And increasingly, then many migrants are attempting very dangerous routes of other alternate ways to cross that are, then deemed illegal and so forth. If you're interested in learning more about some of the issues around U.S. refugee policy that I've mentioned with, policymaker narratives and how they've sort of justified refugee policies over time, even like the changing images of who refugees are, these are some things in my book, Reconfiguring Refugees. As Bob mentioned, it's available in August. You can either go to New York University Press, or I think it's also available to pre-order from Amazon and some of those other sites. But please do let me know if you have any questions about that book. And thank you so much for your attention today.
Thank you so much, Alise. Really appreciate that. And it is a very complex and complicated story as we look at all this. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring in Laurie Martinez to join us as well. Now, Laurie is the Immigration Services Manager for the Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Green Bay. And Laurie helps resettled refugees navigate the complexities of U.S. immigration law. So I'm hoping to hear the two of you, Alise and Laurie, think a little bit together about the most complicated sorts of stories, or the most common, maybe I should say, sorts of complications that you see with individuals and families who are working through these difficult legal processes. Laurie, let's start with you. What are some of the most challenging aspects that you see for families who are trying to navigate this very complicated landscape?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. As Robert mentioned, yes, I am the manager of the Immigration Legal Services program here at Catholic Charities. And so probably, there's the immigration process, I think, is complicated in general for anyone, and can especially be for our refugee clients. So there's all different pathways that people can go, and we can assist people to file different applications. And so probably the most difficult thing for some of them to understand is that when they hope to reunite with their family members, they may think that it's going to be a fast process when in reality it can take many years, which is very unfortunate. And we see that especially with the Afghan population that we're working with here in Green Bay. Many of the individuals have left spouses and children behind, and they've been able to either go through the process, applying for the green card, or have been granted asylum, and then are filing the application to reunite with their family members, and these applications are getting approved, but they're kind of stuck in limbo, and we just don't know how long. It's hard to predict a date when that will be approved and when the family will actually enter the United States. And not only that, just the immigration process in itself is, understanding about the form that they have to file. And, it's quite a lengthy form that the refugees will file when they apply for the green card. And generally that's after 1 year of being in the United States. They can file that application. There's different requirements. They have to do a smaller portion of the medical exam, but the application is quite detailed and, asks a lot of questions, and, which are, basically to make sure that, there's no prior crimes or prior activities that they may have participated in their home countries. And so, yeah, it can be challenging, and even just the fact of understanding the documents that they receive when they enter the United States, they kind of, we have seen people come into the United States, they have a bag, they have the IOM bag with all their documents, and they probably don't really even know this, the importance of those documents in itself, like what their I-94s, and, what they mean. So it's all kind of, very new information for them. And then if they don't have another friend or family member here in the area, yeah, it can be hard and with language barrier, it can be very challenging.
You mentioned, Laurie, how long it takes for some of these cases to proceed, especially for family reunification. How long, just a quick question that came through on the Zoom just now, how long does it take for a client to get in to see you, to get in to see your staff? Is there a wait list, or is that part pretty quick?
It can vary from our department. Like another staff member here, I know she's booking into July, maybe late in July. It really just depends on what is going on, and you know, there have been times where we've had to meet deadlines with the Afghan population, so then we've been swamped with, you know, trying to meet those deadlines, or it can be with any other immigrant population. When there's something going on, we may see a huge rush of people to apply for documents. We always suggest, when we meet with people, we suggest to plan early, try to schedule appointments, and, you know, like contact, if they have a 1 year time that they can apply, call maybe 2-3 months before to set up that appointment, just so they can make sure that, you know, if there's any concern about time, that they can get in for an appointment.
So I know that some of the increased urgency right now comes from the uncertain political climate and how fast things might have to happen. Alise, has that always been the case? I mean, you went back in some of your statistics to a more bipartisan era of resettling Vietnamese refugees when it still wasn't most welcome. They were in the low 30s in terms of percent support. But it seems as though Laurie and her team and others we know who are doing refugee resettlement are very much subject to changing political winds right now. Is this just kind of how it works in the US, or is this something that you would see as relatively new?
I think that's a great question, Bob. And I think that the 2016 elections really did change things, because prior to that, it was not controversial for you know, Republicans and very conservative lawmakers to stand up and defend refugee rights. And you know, despite low or apathetic public opinion during many of those previous so-called refugee crises, just the policymakers had that will, and it wasn't anything that could get them in trouble for their next election. That really changed after 2016. And we saw there were a few conservative Republican lawmakers who did still try and bring up issues around refugee resettlement, and they ended up either losing their election to their challenger, or they ended up resigning, and that was like their last term in Congress. So just the landscape of Congress has changed so much that now it is incredibly like a roller coaster. But then, of course, we see with asylum seeking, I would almost say it doesn't really matter at this point, because the Biden administration has, you know, just come out with this executive order, if people were following that in the last couple of weeks, that essentially shuts down asylum at the border once a certain threshold of crossings, irregular crossings, is met per day. And that's something that, you know, if people that were more liberal politically or Democrats politically, if they were thinking that, well, having a Democratic presidency is a guarantee that there will be more, you know, immigrant rights or immigrant-friendly policies, that's just not happening anymore with asylum seekers. So for refugees, yes, I would say for overseas refugee resettlement, it will matter, is it a Democrat or a Republican? For spontaneous arrivals of asylum seekers at the border, it just seems now that there's a crackdowns from both sides.
I want to come back to the phrase you use in your book title, responsibility sharing, because when you talk about the crackdown on the border and the limiting the number of asylum seekers, I don't recall anything in asylum law that says you can turn them away when they get to a certain quota or get to a certain number. It talks about people who come to your border seeking safety. They cross the border, and countries who have signed on to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its later elements are responsible for taking care of those individuals, making sure that they're safe and that they have many of the same benefits as citizens while their cases are being adjudicated. We do rapid determination in those cases. We try to resolve it quickly, but actually shutting them out seems inconsistent with that. Now, I don't really want to debate that policy so much as ask you about motivation. Some of us in the past have talked about the economic benefit of immigration. I recall a mayor in Sweden when I asked him about the number of refugees that his town had taken in. He said, "This is fantastic." He said, we're taking in workers who we did not have to invest in. We didn't pay anything for their education or their support. And now they're here, they're ready to work, they're ready to pay taxes. And he was excited about the anticipated economic benefit. Now, it didn't necessarily work out that way. But people are often writing about the economic benefit of immigration. And in particular, the kind of, if I want to say, the right sorts of immigrating workers, of skilled immigration. But when you talk about responsibility sharing, it's not really an economic argument, is it? It feels more like a moral argument that this is simply what we do. It's what we should do. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point, Bob. I think that there have been for years now arguments made about and studies done that show the extensive amount of, influx into taxes that immigrant communities provide. Those immigrant rights organizations have shared those. Immigration policymakers that are trying to argue for certain policies have shared those statistics. It doesn't seem to matter. So I think that, one problem that can actually come from that is it almost creates this idea, like going back to Dina Nayeri and the ungrateful refugee, that like somebody isn't worthy of protection unless they're, bringing in economic productivity. And that's one thing that I worry about too with that argument, is just looking at people who are escaping desperate situations, and often that are causally contributed to by the U.S. foreign policies, as only meriting support on a transactional basis if they're going to do something for us. So that's one issue I have with it. The other issue is, like I said, just empirically, those studies don't really move the needle on public opinion. People don't believe them or just don't care. But I think the moral arguments around responsibility sharing are arguments where we really need to connect the dots for people to why are these people displaced? What's happening in their countries, and what is the role of U.S. government, history, legacies of foreign policy, legacies of military operations? How is it connected in that way? And I think that is something that people can really start to see when they understand the details of that history, that it's not that, the refugees owe us gratitude or the refugees owe us economic productivity, but there are a lot of cases where you could make the case the United States government owes those populations some form of support after what the U.S. government has done in those countries.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It does feel like a moral issue in that regard. It feels like what's right and who we ought to be. So the two of you are dealing with these issues all the time. You are living with U.S. refugee policy in your daily lives. And for the rest of us who don't really live there so much, there can be a lot of misunderstanding, lots of confusion. So just one final question as we move to wrap up. And I'll ask you, Laurie, to go first, and then Alise. What are some of the most common misunderstandings that you see from the general public when they hear about the kind of work you do? Or maybe to put it another way, what would you most like your fellow citizens to understand about U.S. policy and refugee resettlement?
I guess I would say, I'm agreeing with Alise that some people don't understand the cause, some of the displacement of individuals, especially like if we talk about like Afghanistan. In working with the individuals that I've been working with, the majority of the people really had no choice. of where they were going to go and whether their family was going to be with them or not. They really didn't have a choice. They, kind of were like, okay, you have to come with us. You have to get on an airplane and go. Which is, I mean, I can't even imagine that it's difficult. So yeah, just really understanding the process about refugee resettlement. And sometimes I think it takes people like seeing the graphics, like what was shown before, of what actually goes into refugee resettlement for people to understand. And, there are a lot of confusion over refugees and immigrants. So, yeah, I guess those are, some of the main things that, I try to explain to people.
Alise, how about you?
Yes, I agree with Laurie on, they need to understand the causes. And I guess I would also just reiterate a point I mentioned about how discrimination fits in. If listeners could also just think about, why is it that people have so much pride to put Ukrainian flags outside their homes in the last couple of years and want to become private sponsors for Ukrainian families that are paroled here? But then why is it that if somebody is from Haiti or Afghanistan or Syria, like, it's just different? And I think people don't often catch themselves in that little subtle discriminatory a gap in perception of the groups that are deemed as more worthy or deserving or like us, quote, like Americans, or will assimilate, versus those who will be culturally different. And so I would just really encourage people to read the perspectives of people from Syria, Afghanistan, Haiti, Congo, Iran, like to really go inside the other. If that's not your identity, try and understand what life is like in that other identity. If you feel like your community, you have great relationships with Ukrainians, and that's wonderful. And a lot of Ukrainians have needed help desperately, and that support has been crucial. But why might you feel less comfortable putting yourself in the mind of someone of a different kind of category? And so that's what I would just challenge people to do, and that I also try and do, and challenge myself to read those perspectives and listen to those interviews, and just think outside my own identity box.
Thank you for that. And yes, just to underscore that, the point you just made about we don't want people to do less for Ukrainians, but we do want them to do more for those unlike themselves, all of us. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It's challenging, but really important. And you've helped us to think through how we can best manage that moving forward. So as we wrap up, I'd like to thank Professor Alise Coen from UW Green Bay, Laurie Martinez from Catholic Charities, and our co-sponsors with the Brown County Refugee Task Force, Catholic Charities, and Wisconsin Literacy. I'd also like to thank Jill Olson and Shania Johnson, who've been making things happen behind the scenes. Our next webinar in the series is going to take place on June 27th, also at noon Central. And we're going to be joined by Jill Drzwicki from Jesuit Refugee Service in Rome. So you can register at the Mothi Center website as you did this time, and you can see some information there, hopefully on your screens. The June 27 webinar will focus on snapshots from the refugee journey, thinking a little bit about what happens in some of those refugee camps, where, as Alise pointed out, maybe only 1% will make it out to be resettled elsewhere. So we're going to look at that journey, and we're going to think a little bit about some of the specific journeys that people have made to our region. So I want to thank you all for joining us. And again, you can register for this next one at the Mothi Center website. Once again, thanks so much, Alise and Laurie. Really, really appreciate what you're doing in your work and in the time that you spent with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.